4 years after the death of Genghis Khan, the drummers of the Qin kingdom in northern China were once again beating out an alarm. In 1231, 2 decades after the Mongols' first invasion, they had returned in force. This time, the Qin defenders faced a Mongol expedition determined to conquer the Qin once and for all. Under Genghis Khan, the earlier Mongol campaigns in northern China had been savage raids bent on plunder and pillage. But on his deathbed, Genghis supposedly bequeathed to his sons a far greater objective.
I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave to you.
His successor, Ögedei, swore to obey his father's command. But first, Ögedei had to learn to govern the lands the Mongols had already conquered, and for this, he turned to foreign advisors. The most famous and influential was Yelu Chucai, a young official captured from the Qin court who rose from prisoner to prime minister. He convinced Ögedei that if the Mongols would be masters of the world, then they would need a capital from which to rule it.
Though the empire may be conquered on horseback, it cannot be governed on horseback.
A permanent capital would be built right in the heart of the steppe, at the junction of trade routes used by the nomads and merchants for thousands of years. Genghis had established a military base in the area, and by the 1230s it had grown into a sprawling tent city. As a nomadic stronghold, it was impressive, but as a political capital, it was totally inadequate. The ever-expanding court administration and all its records were housed in tents. After traveling for thousands of miles, ambassadors and their entourage were granted the hospitality of a Mongol tent. Even audiences with the most powerful men in Asia were conducted inside a tent. Ögedei's decision to build a capital was revolutionary for a nomad. It meant abandoning a way of life that had endured for centuries, a life without walls or fences. Nevertheless, the new capital was not much bigger than a large town. Behind 3 miles of defensive walls, there was a small inner compound, or palace city. It was called Karakorum. Little of it remains today, but even in its heyday, it was not another Rome. The empire was not there to serve Karakorum, it was the other way around. This was the home to thousands of artisans, marched from all corners of the empire to work for the Mongol court. It is still possible to imagine what it must have looked like 800 years ago. This is a Buddhist monastery built in the 16th century on the site of Karakorum. The assembly halls were mostly wooden, designed and built by Chinese artisans. They were richly decorated with silks and carpets and golden fountains from which flowed wine and fermented mare's milk. The streets echoed of horsemen and caravans. The sounds mingled with calls to prayer from Buddhist monks and other clerics. Centuries later, the stones and timbers of Karakorum were rearranged by the Buddhists to build their temples and monastery walls. The city was extraordinary for the variety and number of places of worship: Taoist, Buddhist, and Manichaean temples, mosques, even a small Nestorian church. While others waged war to defend their faith, Karakorum defended religious tolerance. Karakorum became the most important seat of government in Asia. Even before it was completed, a stream of envoys came to pay their homage to the great Khan. But while Ögedei was still building his capital, his armies were on the move in northern China. Unlike previous campaigns, this war was proving long and difficult. For 3 years, the advantage swung from one side to the other. Eventually, the Mongols gained the upper hand. Millions of Chinese had perished. Millions more fled south, and Chinese power was reduced to a tiny enclave around the city of Kaifeng. Everyone who could took refuge here for a final stand. This was the most formidable city the Mongols had ever encountered. Qin power would not be extinguished until it had fallen. Kaifeng itself was an important trading center in the Orient, and had a population, now swollen by refugees, of more than 1 million people. It had long been a center for the artists, poets, and scholars, for merchants and craftsmen. It had many fine buildings and held one of the richest treasure houses in all China. Conquering this populous city was vital to the invaders. For the Mongols, the city walls were both a physical and a psychological barrier. Their success depended on speed and mobility, not on drawn-out sieges. The Mongols learned to be patient. The skilled enemy knew how to use artillery and gunpowder. They suffered great casualties. When eventually the city did fall, they took quick revenge for their losses. They executed all the male members of the Qin royal family, and there were a great many of them. Then they deported the women to Karakorum as slaves. Next, they rounded up all the men and examined them. All the craftsmen, doctors, and clerks were deported. The rest were held in the city, unaware that the Mongols planned to execute them all. Not just in Kaifeng, but throughout all of northern China. It was to be genocide on an unprecedented scale. The Mongols destroyed what they didn't understand, and they didn't understand cities or farmers. When Lei Chucai heard the plan, he interceded. He explained to the Mongol commanders that simple revenge was a sterile policy. The wealth of a city or a country lay in its people and their skills. Destroying them was pointless. Some of the harder-riding Mongols remained unconvinced. Farming to them seemed a useless occupation. It would be better, they said, to exterminate all the peasants and let grass grow for their horses to graze. But Ögedei listened to Yelu Chucai, especially when he learned that the Mongols expected 500,000 pieces of silver a year, almost as many sacks of grain, and 80,000 bolts of silk. The great Khan was persuaded to spare the Chinese. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return. By 1235, with the conquest of the Qins complete, the empire now stretched from the Korean peninsula to the Caspian Sea, an area of more than 3 million square miles, a third of all Asia. All of it governed from Karakorum, deep in the Mongolian steppe. Such a remote capital needed a good supply system. The city only existed because the Khan had willed it, so everything had to be brought to it. "500 caravans arrived every day, carrying food and raw materials for the army of artisans and builders. From the conquered lands, the government records and, of course, tax revenues poured in endlessly from every corner of Asia. This was Genghis Khan's dream, the world paying homage to the steppe. The capital depended on a fast and reliable messenger service. Ögedei had to keep in touch with his commanders throughout the far-flung empire. Called the Yam, it was made up of riders who traveled day and night to distant outposts on imperial business. The riders wore these large metal medallions called pesas, which identified for which business they were traveling. Most were made of wood or base metal, but some were made of gold, testifying to the rank of the bearer. This one reads, "The person using the horse must wear the pesa or else be detained." The fastest couriers were the arrow riders. It was common for them to ride over 200 miles a day, for 10 days at a time, sleeping and eating on the saddle. The couriers also escorted dignitaries. Many a rich merchant boasted that the highways of Asia had never been as safe as under the rule of the great Khan. By all accounts, it was an astonishing operation. Thousands of post stations were established along the ancient highways. Every 30 miles, a rider would find food, shelter, and fresh horses. If on urgent business, a courier would be swathed in bells to signal his approach to the station custodian, who would have horses saddled and waiting. The Yam also served as the eyes and ears of the Khan, gathering information from beyond the empire's frontiers. By 1235, with the victory over the Qin, and with Karakorum almost complete, Ögedei was ready to plan the next step. He called a Kurultai, a council of leaders, and here, amidst the dancing shamans, the mandate from heaven was reaffirmed, that God had ordained that the Mongols should rule the world. After several days of conferencing, the generals determined the details for the next world conquest. And on the appointed day, Ögedei rode out to proclaim to the masses that the Mongols were ready for the greatest and most ambitious military expeditions in their history. Preparation would take another 3 years. The great General Ögedei would lead the expedition. He had accompanied Genghis 15 years before this campaign. Scouts would be sent ahead to prepare the way. From beneath his canopy, Ögedei ordered the construction of siege machines and summoned engineers from the four corners of the empire to assist. Their mission was to rule all the lands as far west as any Mongol horse had trod. It meant the conquest of all Russia and Europe. In 1237, the army set out. Alongside the army were herds of camels, sheep, and cattle, plus a huge retinue of Chinese physicians, Arab bridge builders, Persian water engineers, craftsmen, and interpreters. Wives and children came too. It was as if the whole nation was on the march. The army marched for 2,000 miles and across the Altai Mountains before they could aim for their first objective, the city of Bulgar by the shores of the Volga River. Beyond it lay the rich Russian principalities, with the center at Kiev. Before the invasion could begin, the Mongols had to secure their lines of communication. This meant that any threat from the kingdom of Bulgar had to be eliminated. The Mongols were so single-minded that Bulgar ceased to exist. Then they swept on into Russia. To the defending armies, the invaders' tactics were baffling. On encountering their opponent, a small contingent of lightly armed suicide troops, known as the Mongol, would charge straight at the enemy lines. Once they had showered the enemy with arrows, they turned and fled, invariably drawing the opposition after them in hot pursuit. The Mongol would lead them to a prearranged spot where the Mongol archers lay in waiting. The enemy ranks, now spread out, were easy targets. Volley upon volley of arrows rained down on the enemy horsemen. The Mongol heavy cavalry dealt the final blow. By now, the army consisted of much more than just cavalry. The Mongols had honed the skills of siege warfare, and their tactics became increasingly sophisticated. They had to. Their forward scouts reported that an increasing number of castles and walled cities lay ahead. This is a model of the Mongol ballista. It could hurl a 100-pound boulder nearly 200 yards against a city wall. The Mongols equipped themselves with Chinese and Persian weapons experts who built siege engines and even developed primitive explosives to terrify the enemy. The Mongols also used the element of surprise. They preferred to attack in the heart of winter, when and where they were least expected. Life on the steppes had taught them many things. The forward scouts who crossed the frozen Volga into Russia during the winter of 1237 were the vanguard of the most formidable fighting machine on Earth. The Russians had no clear idea what was emerging out of the east. The Mongol hordes storm from now continues. After Bulgar, the Mongols focused their wrath on the city of Ryazan. For 5 days, they battered the city walls until they finally crumbled. Most inhabitants were butchered. The few survivors were encouraged to escape and spread the news, to demoralize the next city. In every church, the prayer went up.
Save us, O Lord, from the wrath of the Tartars.
Certainly no earthly agency could prevail. The Mongols attacked several places at once, so the Russian principalities could not unite against the common enemy. They were carved up and dealt with one by one. From Ryazan, the Mongols moved to Suzdal, then to Moscow. According to the Russian chroniclers, the men of Moscow ran away before the barbarians came in sight. From Moscow, they moved to take Vladimir, then Kozelsk. Town after town, city after city, they moved relentlessly through all of Russia. No eye was left open to weep for the dead. The Mongols continued their relentless assault. Finally, they made their approach on Kiev. This great city boasted 30 gold-domed churches. It was the largest Christian stronghold the Mongols had encountered. Its capture would send shockwaves throughout eastern Christendom. A chronicler reported that as their armies approached,
the ground shook with the noise of the massive herds of camels, bullocks, and horses. Behind the walls, it drowned out speech, and the dust that was kicked up hung in the sky like clouds.
The Mongols planned to take Kiev peacefully, until defending commanders began throwing down the bodies of Mongol envoys from the city gate. Their act of defiance sealed the city's fate. Within 2 days, the wooden walls had been breached. The Mongols stormed inside and charged up the narrow city streets. One of the few structures to survive was the Chapel of Santa Sophia. But all the Byzantine treasures were carried away, the tombs of saints and princes desecrated, and their bones scattered and burnt. With Rome and Constantinople, Kiev was one of the great Christian centers of the Western world. Its destruction was appalling. Some survivors managed to escape here into the tunnels under the foundations of Santa Sophia. Here they stayed with hidden treasures and the prayers of the clergy until the sacking had stopped. The slaughter was so fierce that 5 years later, a visitor reported the plain was still covered with human remains. The destruction of Kiev left a scar on the Russian people that has yet to heal. In 1239, after nearly a year of campaigning, the Mongol armies, tired but victorious, moved to the Ukraine to rest, take stock, and plan their next move. The Mongol advance to the edge of Europe was the furthest west any Asian people had come since Attila the Hun 1,000 years earlier. The imminent encounter with Christendom would be one between two completely different worlds. The Mongols had an array of weapons that had never been seen in Europe. At the heart of the Mongol army was the archer. Whether mounted or on foot, he wielded a bow of terrifying power. This was the Asian or compound bow, made from yak horn and bamboo. Horn and bamboo were glued together and then bound until they set into a single piece. When the bow was strung, it was stressed against the natural curve, creating massive tension and allowing the archer to send an arrow much further and faster than any European opponent. The Mongol arrow had also evolved into a sophisticated missile. By varying the flight and weight of the wood, the Mongol archer had a large selection of projectiles to choose from. Arrows that would pierce mail, carry messages, make a whistling noise through the air, or even deliver explosives. The mounted archer would fire at full gallop more than a dozen shots a minute. In comparison, the latest in European technology was the crossbow. Although powerful, it had only half the range of the Mongol bow and was slow and cumbersome. A typical European army of the time was made up of a motley collection of troops, led by a variety of knights and local nobility. They in turn owed some kind of allegiance to the king. Unlike the Mongol leaders, the nobles may or may not have had warfare experience. To make up the numbers, groups of peasants were drafted, often at the last minute. But the strength of the army was still the cavalry. Some of these horsemen would have been knights from the various holy orders, the Knights Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights. They were warrior monks bound by religious ritual, celibacy, vows of poverty, and devotion to the church. Though they spent much of the time practicing the arts and rituals of war, they were not experienced at fighting as part of disciplined units. They preferred individual hand-to-hand combat with their enemy, assuming, of course, that they ever got that close. But the greatest distinction between the two armies was the European development of protective armor. A full suit of armor was very heavy and weighed down a European knight considerably. Over the woolen stockings, he wore mail leggings that laced all the way up to the crotch. These alone weighed 20 pounds each. Then there was the mail shirt, another 50 or even 60 pounds. In contrast, the Mongol warrior wore a silk undershirt, a defense against arrows. The worst harm an arrow makes is when it is removed from a wound. The barbed head tears away at the flesh. But silk is not punctured by an arrow, but carries into the wound, twisting around the head of the arrow. So by carefully pulling the shirt out of the wound, the arrow can be removed without tearing the flesh. The knight's tunic was ineffective against Mongol arrows. Over a felt tunic, the Mongol wore a leather cuirass. It weighed about 20 pounds. Probably the greatest handicap for the Europeans was headgear. The mail coif weighed about 20 pounds. Then finally, there was the bucket-shaped helm, another 10 pounds. With lance, shield, and broadsword, the European horseman expected his mount to carry more than 300 pounds into battle. It all looked impressive, but it was no match for the Mongols, who were light, quick, and very mobile. The Mongols' objective was the great flat fertile plains of Hungary. There they could graze their horses before moving deeply into Europe. But they worried about the King of Hungary's relations with various Polish princes. The Mongols had to ensure that no Polish armies came to his aid. So in a daring gamble, they divided their army. The invasion of Europe would be conducted on two simultaneous fronts, 600 miles apart. The larger army would march through the Carpathian Mountains, the gateway to Hungary and southern Europe. The smaller contingent would ride into Poland to draw off any armies that might go to the aid of the Hungarians. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return.
Explore the differences between men and women and the sources of addiction as we enter the human mind on Science Frontiers, Thursday at 9 on TLC.
I think I'll make fresh dressing.
Good seasons?
Mm-hmm.
Which oil?
Pick a light one.
Dressing's great.
Good seasons. You make it fresh, you make it best.
I've learned to control my excitement for the taste of the Ocean Spray Cranberry.
Bow, hop into the hickaboo hoodoo now, hop into the hickaboo.
Sweet tart!
Hop into the hickaboo hoodoo now, bow.
Ocean Spray Cran drinks. It's amazing what a little cran can do.
Weekday afternoons on the Learning Channel. See for yourself why America's really cooking with the Chinese galloping gourmet Martin Yan. So don't forget, Yan Can Cook, Monday through Friday at 2 and 5 on TLC.
There are a lot of smart reasons to apply for the American Express card. Just call us at 1-800-THE-CARD.
And then a canceled flight won't leave you stranded.
I can't believe they canceled our flight.
It'll be fine. This is a great day. It's a beautiful drive.
Because unlike a bank card, the American Express card has no preset spending limit.
You can apply right over the phone.
With the American Express card, you're in control. You pay your bill in full. There's no revolving debt, no outrageous interest. You stay out of that trap.
So call 1-800-THE-CARD. You can apply right over the phone.
I still don't know where I lost that wallet. My whole life was in it. Pictures, license.
So we're on bread and water?
No. New card.
If you ever lose the card or it's stolen, you can get a replacement in 24 hours.
Don't delay. Call 1-800-THE-CARD and apply now.
The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, now continues. The invasion of Poland in February 1241 took the various Polish city-states completely by surprise. The Mongols drove toward Krakow, the most powerful of all the city-states. When a Mongol advance patrol was sighted from the steeple of St. Mary's Church, a trumpet alarm was sounded. The garrison set out to meet the invader. It was ambushed and destroyed. Most of Krakow's inhabitants fled in panic. Ever since that day in March 1241, a trumpeter has sounded the alarm, and at precisely the same note, he abruptly stops his call. Legend says that at that point, a Mongol arrow struck, silencing the trumpeter. At nearby monasteries, most of the monks were slaughtered, their relics and treasures plundered, the buildings destroyed. On this campaign, the Mongols seldom took prisoners. What could they do with them? What was the point? The city of Krakow was also leveled, along with Lublin and Breslau. By now, the alarm had been raised in all the cities along the Baltic. The call went out across Europe for armies to meet the invader. "500 miles to the south, the main Mongol army was making its way through the frozen passes of the Carpathian Mountains. The lightly defended Hungarians were surprised and quickly overwhelmed. Soon the Mongols poured through the valleys and down onto the Hungarian plains. They swept through Transylvania, Moldavia, and Wallachia before any defense could be mounted. For the Hungarians, the invasion marked the beginning of one of the most terrifying chapters in history, which was enshrined forever in the Great Hungarian Chronicle. In the capital, all hopes rested with King Bela. He commanded the greatest cavalry in Europe, but getting on the field was proving a problem. The Hungarian nobility refused to accept Bela's command, and as they argued among themselves, the Mongols moved relentlessly westward. From their fortified position overlooking the Danube, the Hungarian defenders looked out across the water at their enemy, sitting on the opposite bank. The Mongol commander drew up his army right under the nose of his opponent. Once again, their strategy was to draw the enemy out into the open, onto ground the Mongols had already selected. They prepared their battle lines and eagerly awaited reports from the army in Poland. Before they made any move against the Hungarians, the Mongol commanders needed to make sure the Poles would not aid the Hungarian king. In fact, relays of messengers brought news that a large northern European army was gathering to confront the Mongols in Poland. The messengers claimed there were Teutonic Knights, Knight Hospitallers, and even Templars from France. The result of the forthcoming encounter would decide the fate of the entire expedition and the rest of Europe. The knights put their faith in prayer and sharp steel. With tried and tested tactics, the Mongols drew the European cavalry out into the open. Before the infantry could advance behind the cavalry, a smoke screen began drifting onto the battlefield, effectively cutting off the two units from each other. The infantry suddenly found themselves surrounded by ranks of Mongol archers who promptly cut them to pieces. Out of the swirling smoke, a contingent of Mongol heavy cavalry charged down upon the remaining ranks of the knights. It ended quickly, and when the smoke had lifted from the scene, the Europeans were scattered everywhere, dead or dying. The Poles later claimed the Mongols outnumbered their own men 3-1, and that they had the help of dragons who belched poison gas. Obviously, this was not the case. An Oriental army had taken on the very flower of European cavalry and cut it to ribbons. 30,000 lay dead. The Mongol commander ordered an ear to be cut from every European killed. 9 sacks were filled. 2 days later, and 600 miles to the south, on the fields of Mohi, the second Mongol front also achieved victory. On the field of Mohi, near the Hungarian capital, Mongol warriors destroyed Bela's cavalry. 40,000 more lay dead. So, just 4 years after leaving Mongolia, an army that had marched 6,000 miles commanded all of Eastern Europe. Soon after, Mongol patrols reached to the very walls of Vienna. Indeed, no army of any consequence stood between the Mongols and the Atlantic Ocean. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return.
This weekend on the Learning Channel, curl up and relax in the country charm and cozy
crusade against the invader, but few had the stomach for almost certain death. Even if the Europeans had put up a united front, it's unlikely they could have found a leader to match the genius of Ögedei. So people just waited. Then, suddenly, one May morning in 1242, the Mongol armies disappeared. They were gone. Unbeknown to the European defenders, they had quietly and without ceremony folded up their tents, gathered their herds, and headed east, away from Europe. This, it turned out, was not another elaborate maneuver, but a complete and total withdrawal. The Mongols left after getting dramatic news from the Mongol homeland. The great Khan, Ögedei, was dead, and while a new Khan was being chosen, the local commanders decided to withdraw. The great army came to rest here in southern Russia, near the banks of the river Don. For the time being, at least, Europe escaped Mongol occupation. But for the people who prayed in these Russian churches, the return of the invader marked the beginning of the longest and darkest chapter in Russian history. It became known as the Mongol yoke. Through a typical campaign of terror, the Mongols quickly re-established their authority over the separate principalities. Once they had extracted complete submission from the people, they let local princes keep their positions. The Mongols preferred to rule at arm's length. They were too few in number to construct a hands-on government. They didn't care much for administration either. Each year, these vassal princes would gather before their Mongol masters, hand over vast quantities of tribute, renew their oaths of submission, and then bow down and kiss, literally, the Mongol spurs. Before long, the Mongol rulers of this region became fabulously wealthy. This part of their empire was known as the Golden Horde. For the first time in history, Western Christians were ruled by an Oriental aristocracy. They stamped their way of life on the local psyche, just as they would in China and the rest of Asia. From these cliff-top citadels in the Crimea, Mongol warlords held sway, absolute power, over an area the size of Europe for the next 300 years. For a people who had always depended on mobility, the Mongols now took up permanent residence. They even built citadels and castles from which to reinforce their rule. 1,000 miles to the west in Europe, the legacy of the Mongol invasion was a continuing bewilderment. While many gave thanks for their deliverance, others tried to make some sense of what happened. In Poland, the locals quickly explained their survival by convincing themselves that they had actually defeated the invader. A festival, the Reikoniki, was established in Krakow. Someone was dressed up in a fanciful Mongol costume, while the crowd made fun of the invader. A great victory, it was claimed, had been won over the Oriental, and they would never return again. But it was a fairy story. The Poles had deluded themselves. Elsewhere, Europe waited in breathless awe for what many feared would be the inevitable return of the invader.
Desert caves yield important clues, showing how North America's first inhabitants lived their ancient lives. Next on TLC's Archaeology.